first thing I want to do diving in here, I want you to tell me a little bit about your background. First off, obviously from the area, just kind of tell me how,
Yeah.
kind of just a little bit about yourself.
I grew up in Evansville, went to Oak Hill grade school and then Harrison High School. At Harrison, I did a lot of journalistic things. And when I went to college at Butler University in Indianapolis, I was a journalism major and I loved to write, and spent about 5 years out of college writing for newspaper, magazines, even a little advertising, copywriting, until I couldn't pay my bills anymore. And I went into more technical. I was an IT professional for 35 years and retired a few years ago.
So where did the love of baseball start for you? Obviously, we're all children. We all
Yeah.
at one point love a sport, have a passion. Where did that start for you?
I can honestly say it happened right here where I'm sitting. In 1966, after 9 years without a minor league team, the Chicago White Sox put a Class AA team here called the Evansville White Sox, nicknamed the E-Sox. And my grandfather bought season tickets, and I spent a lot of time here just watching baseball and loving it. And it's a great place to watch a game, obviously. But that's where I got my love of it to begin with.
And once that passion and love for baseball evolves, how do you get to a point, obviously with your journalistic background, how do you get to the point of, in your mind, going, I want to write a book, I want to research this information, and I want to put pen to paper and obviously do what you've done?
Right. Well, I always wanted to write a book about the Evansville White Sox. They only lasted 3 years. Minor league baseball in the mid-'60s was on a big decline. So I was going to write a book about them. So after I retired, so I started looking for history books about baseball in Evansville. Couldn't find any. I said, well, why don't I just write about the whole thing? And that was my first book. I started right after the Civil War and took it to 1970 when Evansville did the impossible and got a AAA team here. So I wrote the history of baseball in Evansville. I'm glad to say. That was my first book, and got published.
So that first book, so it's just an entire encapsulation of the history, or did you start at a certain point? Just what was kind of the overarching?
Well, it encapsulates 100 years, basically. And I started when baseball became a big thing in the United States. That was after the Civil War. I started looking through Evansville journals and newspapers, periodicals, and found it was hot here. It was a hot item. And they played everywhere. There were hundreds of teams. I mean, they were amateur, but and I kind of took it through history until Evansville got into organized baseball, which is basically minor leagues, and had successes, a lot of failures through the 1800s. And then finally, around 1900, it became more established and kept teams pretty much for a long time. And I went to the point where Bosse Field was built and kept going through the war years and 2 wars, 2 big floods here. Great minor league players came through here. They're in my book. I'm not going to try to name everyone, but I'll name a couple. Warren Spahn and Hank Greenberg were probably the biggest names that came through here as minor leaguers. Took it to the 60s, late 50s, when we lost our team, the Evansville Braves, because this place, Bosse Field, was in such bad shape. The grandstands were collapsing. And it took a long time to rebuild. Finally got a team back in '66. That's where I showed up and became a huge baseball fan.
And why do you think it is that, I mean, obviously there's history in the annals of time of every sport, but why do you think, and I guess this is more philosophical than it is anything, but why do you think it is that the history of a sport in a certain area can be lost at a certain period. Obviously, it dates back several years. Your book has encapsulated that amount of time. Why do you think it's so quick for people to forget what was before?
Well, I mean, I want to pat myself on the back because nobody wrote it down. You know, it was in newspapers. It was a big deal. Nobody chronicled it, is the best I can say. And so I had a open field, and I took the ball and ran with it. And it was so much fun researching this, learning something new every time I looked, and writing down a great sport that we had in Evansville. And again, to plug Bosse Field was a national sensation when it was built because it was municipally owned, first one ever. Stories in major newspapers about it. They kind of set the standard for that, and it still is, right? The school board or the school corporation still owns it. And that's how they got it built in the beginning, through the school corporation. Amazing story.
And why do you think it's so special that Bosse still stands and kind of keeps the same roots and traditions, not making it the shiniest brand new toy, keeping kind of some of that classic feel? Why do you think that's such an important thing?
Well, I mean, I kind of get chills just because there's so much history here. And because this area recognized that this was a showplace, really. It was a showplace. It was also one of the first, if not the first, multi-purpose athletic field. We talked about off camera. They played football here. They had wrestling matches here. You're a wrestling fan. In fact, when Bosse Field opened, the day it opened, they had a ball game during the day, and at night they set up a wrestling ring and got more people for the wrestling match than the first game. There were a little over 8,000 for the first game ever played here. That night there were 10,000 people here for the wrestling match. Amazing stuff.
And obviously you have so much knowledge and history. In terms of, that's his first book, Baseball in Evansville, what are some of your favorite memories of creating this book, and what are some of your more memorable stories that you got to talk about in the book?
Well, it's got a subtitle, Baseball in Evansville Booms Bust, and One Global Disaster. Well, the booms and the busts were mostly financial problems, trying to support a team here. The global disaster was the story of a local guy, an entrepreneur named Walter Dilbeck, who wanted to start a third major league in the mid to late 60s and gave it a whirl. And the headquarters for the Global League were on the top floor of the Executive Inn downtown here. And he tried to do it, and didn't go well.
Now, in terms, you mentioned Warren Spahn, Hank Greenberg. Who are some of your favorite players that people obviously may know, or people that maybe have a hard time kind of digging through and understanding who that person was or the effect they had on the area of Evansville?
Well, Hank Greenberg, he's probably the greatest Jewish major league player in history. Warren Spahn won 363 games in the majors and probably would have won 400 if he wouldn't have fought in the Battle of the Bulge, spent several years in the military. Beyond that, I had some favorites with the White Sox. Bill Melton played for the Evansville White Sox, and he became the first Chicago White Sox player to lead the American League in home runs. So I have a lot of favorite players. I mean, we could spend all day talking about, but those were some big ones.
And now, before we get into your next book coming up and kind of the history of that kind of it coincides with that book here in the area. Obviously, the Negro League stats have been integrated into Major League Baseball these last few weeks. When you first, obviously, you had a little bit of dwelling and helping in that. Obviously, some of your stats kind of have helped those be integrated. What was it like seeing that happen, and just kind of give us a background?
It was interesting because when I first of all, how the second book came about was after my first book, I said, I've only got a couple black teams, short, 7 or 8 pages, and I know there's got to be more. So I was on a mission to find out about it, because they got even less press than your white teams. So I kind of went through history and dug this stuff out, and I found that there were at least 7 Evansville-native ball players who played in the Negro major leagues, is what they are now. One in particular was a phenom, and was at one time recognized as the greatest black pitcher in baseball. He came around a year before Satchel Paige. And even when Satchel came around, he was the greatest for a while. While researching him, I found that they got his birth date wrong, which means he started 2 years earlier, at age 17, in the big leagues than they had in the records at the time. Well, I found the guys who were compiling the records, told them about it, and that, because he was 17, a record he had at the time is now a major league record for a 17-year-old. And I don't want to spoil it. I'm kind of, teasing my book here. It's a great story. And then the other 6, I kind of went through their lives. I researched their lives, remarkable stories. Some amazing, some tragic. And that's my favorite part of this new book, talking about the Evansville-bred Negro major leaguers and their stories. And then I went through I went through and tried to document every team of note through 60 years until the Negro Leagues kind of died in 1960. So there's scads of stories about teams, players, things that were going on at the time. I think people will love it. I think they won't believe it.
And in comparison between both books, I didn't ask you before about the first one, but how long did it take you from the start to the finish to the time it got published, and then obviously this one about to come out? What was kind of the time periods for both?
Well, because my employer can't fire me now, but I started at 3 years before I retired. I would close my office door every day at lunch and do research and a little writing. And it ended up taking about 3.5 years for the first book. Almost a week after I retired, I submitted it to a publisher who got back to me the next day and said, yeah, let's talk about this. So, I heard all these stories that could take forever, might have to self-publish it, but I got lucky in my first try.
And then the second book, from the time you got this one, production started on it, when did you kind of pick up the pen for the next book, and how long did that process?
Well, the first book came out in March of 2020, about the same week that COVID hit.
Wow.
So it was a bad year for selling books. So about a year later, I got my passion back, and this one took 3 years from start to finish. And for this book, the first place I went was an Evansville publisher. My first book was with a regional history publisher, and I'm so glad I'm working with people here. They've been awesome. Great home-owned company. They published the 100-year history of Boise Field. It's kind of coffee table book. Wonderful people to work with.
Before we get into the Riker Giants, I want to ask you about how important it is in your opinion, that the Negro League stats are being integrated? Obviously, we hear stories about Satchel Paige, Josh Gibson, and we know that what Jackie Robinson did to kind of evolve the game of baseball. But in your opinion, how important is it now that those stats are being recognized?
It's incredibly important, and it's long overdue. And I'll call it a problem. The problem is the documentation of these stats is not on par with what the white major leagues have been. And I'll tell you an example. Willie Mays played 1 year with Birmingham Black Barons when he was maybe 17. He hit 2 home runs with them, but they were only documented in stories, not in box scores. No one can find box scores. So they're not being added to his major league home run total. And this is an example throughout Negro League baseball, that there may have been small stories, no box scores. And the problem with not having box scores is how do you know how many at-bats he had that game or any game? So you can, instead of showing he had 2 home runs and 4 at-bats, just 2 home runs. So a lot was missed, and that's unfortunate and will never be regained. So it's important that what we're finding is documented and a part of history.
And do you think it's just a matter of they've just wanted to take their time on finding the correct stats before integrating them, or do you think what do you think made it take so long? Because we're well past the years of obviously segregation and things like that, but why do you think it took so long?
Well, I'll tell you, John, it's still a work in progress. There are still people working hard, looking everywhere they can to add to what they've already brought forward. So it's still going on. It's still taking a lot of time, and that it'll be a dynamic process. Now they say Josh Gibson is the greatest hitter of all time, or Ty Cobb. His batting average, as they discover more, if they open up a vault somewhere and find something, it'll change. It may get higher, it may get lower, but at this snapshot in time, he's the greatest hitter of all time.
What would you say about those players like Josh Gibson, Satchel Paige, maybe even others that aren't as well recognized as those two? What would you say to people that maybe question the legitimacy of whether it's their talent or the leagues that they played in where the talent pool was lesser than? What would your statement be to people that maybe question their talent?
Well, we can. I'll kind of skip to a local Negro team we've talked about, the Riker Giants. They regularly in the 20s played postseason games against white all-star teams, specifically from the 3I League, and regularly beat them in series. Like they'd have a 5-game series in October, and more often than not, the Riker Giants took the series. So, and a lot of those players on the all-star teams went on to the major leagues. So there's evidence that they beat these guys. So I'll just say there's a start, and that went on between major league teams and major league Negro League teams as well. And it was a draw. And the white major leagues did not pound them into submission. They took it on the chin a lot. So that's my example.
And when it comes to the Riker Giants, obviously give us a little background on that, because before we'd even obviously the stats come out that have been integrated now with the Major League Baseball. I dive into research, try to see if there's any kind of association with Negro leagues in this area or black baseball teams in this area. I hear about the Riker Giants. I reach out. Who knows about them? You come up as a guy who knows about them. Tell us about, because they were only here for a short period of time.
They were, well, I'll start with how they got started. Yeah, in 1920 they were called the Evansville Crescents, and it was really the first conglomeration of really good black ball players here. And some came from out of town and cities like Chicago, and the Crescents were like the original breeding ground for players from Evansville to make it to the major leagues, the Negro major leagues, which are now the major leagues. The Crescents, for 4 years, they also played the All-Stars and beat them pretty regularly. But in 1925, a guy named Manson Reichert, who later became the mayor of Evansville, started backing the Crescents. And with his backing, he changed the name of the team to the Lewis Reichert Giants after his father, who died in 1919. And it kind of morphed into just the Reichert Giants. In 1926, they were really good. They had 7 or 8 players who went on to the Negro major leagues. And they played teams from the Negro major leagues, but even though they weren't affiliated, they were a professional team. All they did was play baseball. In 1927, they gained entry into the Negro Southern League, which was formed the same year as the Negro National League in 1920. So it was an established minor league of the Negro leagues. And they lasted about half season. And the Negro Southern League kind of fell apart, mostly financially. Evansville's always been a particularly hard place for people to get and travel and to and from. And they had these long trips to southern, like Mobile and Atlanta, and it was overwhelming cost. The whole league went out of business in 28. The Reichert Giants came back, and so did the Negro Southern League in 29. And it went out of business. The Reichert Giants went out of business again, but they lasted till 1932 as an independent professional team, still playing great teams. And coincidentally, in 1932, the Negro Southern League spent 1 year as a major league when the Negro National League folded because of the pressures of the Great Depression. So it's kind of a storied franchise. Manson Reichert became the mayor, one of the few Republican mayors in Evansville history at the time. And he came back and sponsored the team again in 1946 and 47. And they had Negro major league players. I mean, he always put together a good team. So that's the greatest team in black baseball history in Evansville.
And they played their games here, correct?
Originally, in 1926, you lead me to other stories. And believe me, I'm not ruining the book, because this is the tip of the iceberg. In 1926, they wanted to play all their games here. And Bob Coleman, the manager of the Evansville Hubs at the time in the 3I League, wouldn't let it happen. So Manson Reichert took his team down to Eagle Athletic Field at the corner of Weinbach and Washington, where there was a nice baseball field, and played opposite the Evansville Hubs when the Hubs were in town, and outdrew them by like 5 times. They'd get 2,000 or 3,000 people down here. For the Evansville Hubs games, they get 500 or 600. So in 1927, Bob Coleman said, I can't take this anymore. You can use Bosse Field when we're on a road trip or when we're idle. And so the Reichert Giants played all their games here in 27 and became regular tenants of Bosse Field.
While the Hubs were still playing as well, were they kind of sharing the field?
When the Hubs were out of town on road trips, the Reichert Giants got the field.
Now, was there? I mean, obviously, at that time there was issues, racial issues going on at that time. What was the, from your research, what was it like for both of them to kind of really, were they coinciding with one another? Did they, oh, we're better than them, they're better than us? What was kind of
There didn't seem to be a lot of that. And they, like I said, they had these postseason series against the great white players right here. And the Reicherts, even for some of those postseasons, drew from the Negro National League, kind of pulled in some ringers, 3 of whom are in the Baseball Hall of Fame in Cooperstown, who wore the Riker Giant uniform for at least 1 or 2 games. So, but and it's hard to say because the documentation is not there, but they seem to be reasonably amicable and no fighting or, things like that. And they played each other. So I'm not sure there weren't undercurrents, but I can't say for sure.
And when it comes to the history of sports in general in this area, obviously the state of Indiana is well known for its basketball, but the baseball history is rich as well. Why do you think that this area, this state, is almost a breeding ground for such great stories to be told, or those that haven't been told that still need to be? Why do you think this area is rich for that kind of thing?
Well, again, because of this place we're sitting in today, helps. I mean, we've also had fairly recent players in the major leagues, like Andy Bennis. But I think always having this stadium is just, it's so iconic. And we've played baseball around the city for so long. I mean, other big hotspots before this was built was the Lamasco area for baseball. Newburgh had baseball teams, and like I said, Eagles Park. Lincoln Stadium at Lincoln High School hosted games, Negro League teams. It's just a rich history. I mean, I'm not sure I know why, except we have an iconic ballpark.
And when it comes to, from one fan to another, the state of the game now, how do you feel about where baseball is now that obviously stats are being integrated in Negro Leagues? What do you think the trajectory of the game is, and how do you appreciate it, or do you have things you dislike? What's kind of your opinion on the game?
Well, I'm kind of old school, so nearly everything I take issue with, except the pitch clock.
Really?
I like faster games.
Yeah.
A lot of games I document in the book. I'll tell you how long it took to play it, and they'd be like 90 minutes, 9-inning game, and nowadays they can stretch on 3.5 hours. So people would not be spending, half their life at the ballpark. They'd see a good game and go quickly. The other thing I miss is more station-to-station baseball. Guy singles, bunt him to second, hit to right field, move him to third, sac fly, score a run. I know now it's swing from your heels. and I like, I miss that some of the strategy has gone away in Major League Baseball.
And when it comes to your research for these books, where are you reaching out to? Do you have, not to give away your secret sauce or anything like that, but where do you find the kind of connections, and where do you find the history to be able to document it, to also be able to write about it yourself?
In both books, I have a bibliography at the end. I go to books that have already been written. The great thing about this day and age is most newspapers have been historically digitized, so I can go back to 1889 and find digitized copies. So it made the research easier. I love that. So newspapers, magazines, There wasn't TV. There was no radio for at least, I mean, for the white teams there was, but so I went everywhere. I mean, I went through hundreds of newspapers, 50, 60 books, just looking for little tidbits.
And when these recent stats become integrated, following your hard work and your research, is that something that the major leagues reaches out to you? I know you obviously said you had a little bit of, I don't want to give away any spoilers for the book or anything like that, but is that something someone reaches out to you
No.
for help? Or?
I mean, I just reached out to them when I found an error or errors. Other than that, I'm not in it. They've got a big team at the Society for American Baseball Research, nicknamed SABRE, that's working on this all the time. And they're doing it in conjunction with Major League Baseball. So, like I said, it's a dynamic, ongoing, ever-changing.
And while we're here, I'll be remiss if I didn't ask. We're talking about the history of baseball in Evansville. University of Evansville on a hot streak now, as best as they've been in a long time. Seeing that from afar, watching it on ESPN, being in Indianapolis, what is it like seeing that part of baseball history writing itself now?
It's the best story in a long time here. It's so great. I have been following it on ESPN Plus. If you don't have a subscription, get one. And I'm not getting any kickbacks on this. That's the beauty of this day and age. I can sit in Indianapolis and watch University of Evansville make history. The other thing is the Braun, the U of E baseball stadium. That's awesome. I mean, those were apartments when I grew up that have since been leveled. It's a beautiful place. Hosted the MVC tournament, which I watched, and did itself proud.
And what do you think, obviously, that program going through such an historic time now, money is being invested into it, whether it's the facilities, they're building a new clubhouse,
I saw
whether
that.
it's the field being at a level to be able to host tournaments where once before it was considered not the greatest place to play on. What do you think what they're doing now will do for themselves to be able to add to that history?
Well, like you said, they're already building a new clubhouse or whatever it's called. There's an example. It's particularly difficult to be a mid-major university nowadays. So things like this elevate their status, and I think what they've done is moves them up in the mid-major level. And I'll talk about basketball. Coach Ragland, I'm so impressed with what he's doing, and it's coming back. It's coming back, and I come down for Aces games once or twice a year. Love it.
And as we wrap up, writing both of these books, seeing your work published, books to be sold, continuously to be sold over time, what is your greatest enjoyment you get? Obviously, maybe financially, but obviously writing the book and being able to put your passion on paper and seeing it distributed. What's your best? What do you get out of that the most?
That it's a history book, that they're history books, and I think they'll stand the test of time. I mean, when I'm gone 50 years from now, I think they'll still be in the libraries and on in bookstores. So that's gratifying.
And you mentioned the second book evolved from you feel like you didn't do enough for the history of black baseball in the first book. Is there something else in the first book or something in the second book? What's next for you? Do you have a third book coming in? What's kind of in the line?
I tell my friends, it's too hard. I'm not sure I can do another one. If I found topics like this that had never been done before and needed to be done, like I know my second book needed to be done, I may get back into it. It's really hard to write a book.
What is the hardest part?
trying to be perfect. My favorite saying as a manager of people was, done is better than perfect. If I wanted to be perfect, I would never finish. So you have to reach a point where you're good enough. You know, I'll find something a year from now and say, gosh, I wish I would have put that in there. But you got to pick a stopping point. That's one of the hardest parts.
And along those same lines, is there stories still to be told, or do you think what you've done in both the books has kind of encapsulated it all, or do you still think there's plenty of history to be told?
I think, I don't think I captured everything. I think, and I'll still dabble in it, and I have a website blog. It's at baseballinevansville.com. If you want to look at it, I've just cranked it up. But I think as I find things, new things, I'll start posting them on there in the stories. So if you want to try to keep up with where I am and where the history of Evansville baseball is, I'm going to try to keep that going. Maybe not in a book, but in a place you can go to see.
Sure, and for those that want to get a copy of the first book, Baseball in Evansville, or the newest book, what is the newest book called?
It's called Black Ball in Evansville, Diamonds in the Shadows. And, you know, that they played in the shadows, basically. Almost unknown until now. The first book was Baseball in Evansville, Booms Busts, One Global Disaster. And you can find, if you Googled my name, you can find where to order it, or you can go to baseballinevansville.com. It'll tell you where to order it, both the books, and I'd appreciate the business.
And for the second book, we can expect kind of sales to start for that? I know
it's in pre-sale right now. You can order it now and get one of the first copies that is supposed to come out in July. So order it now, and it'll be in your mailbox before you know it, and you'll love it.
And for the first book, how, in terms of obviously the success and the gratification you get out of it just for it being what it is, but was it as successful as you wanted it to be in terms of whether it was, you know, sales or anything like that?
It was for me. I mean, it ended up in like CVS and Barnes and Noble, and I took some hits because it came out during the COVID year. Bookstores shut down, books were returned, but it's kind of ramped back up, and I think it's getting more publicity now than probably ever, and it's still selling on Amazon, and literally any online bookstore you could find it. So it's making a comeback.
And two more questions for you. The second book that's getting ready to come out, obviously the integration of these stats probably is serving as a great platform for this book in terms of similarities of what you're talking about and some of the stats themselves being integrated. Was that something you timed out that way? Did you know this was coming, or did it just kind of happenstance and just kind of work?
That was pure happenstance luck. I think the timing is unbelievable. I couldn't have orchestrated it. It's perfect.
And lastly, whether it's sports related, any kind of passion derived thing that someone has, why do you think it's so important, no matter the age, no matter what part of life you're in, why do you think it's so important for someone to be passionate about something like you're passionate about, the history of baseball, and be able to pursue that passion, whether it's writing books or just whatever facet?
Well, it keeps you going. When I see what I've done, I'm really proud of myself. So, and I was passionate about it. It's much easier. I mean, I spent 35 years in information technology and was bored the entire time. This was exciting to me, and exciting things make life what it is.